game was announced, Crowfall player interaction was done entirely within the Kickstarter access to Crowfall's forums. Guilds and players buzzed excitedly, posting up plans for the future, whether it be in the Eternal Kingdoms or guilds out in the campaigns to come. Many players watched eagerly and signed up for guilds that existed briefly, are still here today, and never existed at all within the game. Since player interaction was limited to moderated forums, each of the interesting happenings would come in much later phases of testing. The Hunger Dome and Siege Perilous. After much anticipation, the backers of Crowfall were rewarded with some combat testing they could finally sink their teeth into via the modules of Hunger Dome and Siege Perilous. These each were characterized by individuals and small groups banding together to claim superiority of skill over their foes come the match's end. Some of the small groups came from the leaders and officers of guilds later to be recognized as the major players in the pre-alpha test. Here, the beginnings of rivalries and power struggles could be seen even in such small numbers of testers. The accomplishments of these players would spill over into the next big phase of testing, where the forces of guilds would begin to take shape. Another noteworthy spawning of this primordial soup of player interaction would be the Crowfall Community Discord. This unsanctioned Discord group is unmoderated by the developers, and is a place where players are able to get away with saying a lot more than they are allowed to on the forums. Still alive to this day, the Crowfall Community Discord serves as a place for all guilds and players to discuss and smack talk freely, and provide assistance to new players. Big World. Now we reach the first stage of open world testing, where interactions between players are unfettered from small battle windows. Big World is Crowfall's first iteration of open world PvP. The only friendly players are those in your group. Everyone else is red. And as we know, red is dead. Now that the players are able to explore a world without the constraints of a battle time limit, we begin to see some interesting social interactions. Guilds begin to take material form on both North American and European servers, and rivalries begin to form. On North America, the rivalry between Sugoi and Winterblades takes form, while on the European servers, Caldera takes control. The population of Big World was relatively small, and without factions or guild heraldry in-game, the only way you knew someone was on your team was by memorizing their name, and trying your best to not shoot them by accident. This led to much friendly fire, and a combat style very different from what we see today in faction fights. Groups were more spread out, and guild leaders had to rely on communications and direction to make sure their men didn't start fighting the wrong troops. Big World was in general safer for solo and small group players to make names for themselves. As the population was low, there were a lot of pre-set-up fights and XVX duels, where players vied for honor to prove their individual skill to the server. Since the servers were not up 24/7, people had much shorter windows to roam and look for PvP on the single map zones. As such, much time was spent as solo or small groups fighting each other and attempting to fight even-numbered fights. When out in the world, there was a pretty decent chance of finding another player harvesting or roaming around, or you might be lucky and catch a Ganetian crafting on a mountaintop. If one wanted to fight you, one would simply draw your weapons and attack. If you wanted to pass someone by, you could attempt the universal sign of peace, jumping up and down. If reciprocated, the two players would go on their way. With regards to guild versus guild combat, this build is where we first see the strategy of logging rather than losing. The early Big World guilds were ruthless towards each other, and they were out in force. They would crush their opponents, or log off, rather than fight a losing battle. Since there were no safe zones or temples to hang out in, that was pretty much the only option. Guild fighting on North America was mostly between Winterblades and Sugoi, and there are many YouTube videos from this era depicting engagements between these two guilds. Being the only two major guilds on North America caused a lot of animosity between these two player groups, and as such they showed no mercy towards each other. Since numbers were relatively small on the server, and there were no guild crests under people's names, it was difficult to get accurate counts of combatants. There were endless debates on who had more or less people fighting, and we see the start of the numbers game of Crowfall pre-alpha. During this time, Sugoi grew rapidly and generally was the dominant guild on the North American server during Big World. The European server was a different story. Caldera formed up as the largest European entity and quickly dominated the server. If you ran around on EU and saw someone, there was a good chance it was Caldera. Some smaller guilds popped up, in and out, representing different language groups from Europe. The EU server was much less cutthroat about their engagements. They would often engage in setting up scrimmages for fun. To go along with the new burgeoning guild politics was a slew of hilarious and sometimes devastating bugs. A notable bugged time period that filled every player with dread was the infamous take bug. During this time, whenever a player would press the take button after crafting, an item there was a chance that it would simply disappear and not enter the player's inventory. For a long time, no one could figure out what was causing this bug, and every time an item was crafted, players would sweat with fear that their legendary item would simply poof into the void. Eventually, this was discovered that there was a link between someone pressing the abort button and the take button at the same time. Would cause the completed item from one player to be aborted as well. The take bug reign of terror was finally put to an end, and now crafters can rest easy knowing their items will always find its way nicely to their inventory. Another nostalgic era of Big World was the time of the Great Apple Famine. A rather nasty bug suddenly caused trees to stop dropping apples, which consisted of the main food source for players. The only food source was pine nuts and grubs dropping from trees if the player had the passive training for it. This caused any found apples in an inventory or any food to be seen as a huge and worthy reward for ganking another player. It is from this era that the term apple tax began to be thrown around, as taking someone's apple became ritual of the Crowfall ganking experience. Players would often kill each other and only take the other player's apples, leaving their other valuables on them. Big World was a formative period for many of the veteran players today, and is looked back on quite fondly. Nostalgia clouds our memories of running around endlessly looking for players without mount speed, and inefficiently harvesting resources with whatever tools we could scrape together. With its free-for-all PvP, and the fighting of Big World was unique, the likes of which we may never see again. Many hope the Dregs rule set will be similar, but we will have to see. 4.0 Factions. After Big World comes the next major milestone for Crowfall, which introduces the 3 factions we all know and love today. The guilds now must choose which faction they wish to represent, so that they may still fight each other, and with which to pull new recruits. On North America, it fell to the Winterblades to join Order, Sugoi to join Balance, and the Death Alliance, led by the Undead Lords, to join Chaos. On EU, Caldera and Northlanders went to Chaos, KDS went to Order, and the Burin Sans Frontiers went Balance. More guilds would show up throughout the 4.0 testing, but these are the original and most numerous. On North America, the 3 main guilds would get into fights as often as they could, and for as long as the server would allow. They would use the factions to recruit new players, and all of them grew in number. For the Chaos Death Alliance, the smaller guilds under UDL began to rise to more prominence, such as the Lords of Death and House Avari. Winterblades grew on order, and Sugoi was generally seen as the dominant guild and faction on balance. On EU, smaller guilds began to pop up to challenge Caldera's superiority. During 4.0 is where we see the first instance of Horizon forming after some members of Caldera left their guild and faction. A guild called Soul Tribe, later merging with Horizon, also formed on EU players not in Caldera or KDS. The EU landscape could now be seen as a field of language-specific guilds: French, BSF, German, Northlanders, and the English-speaking KDS Caldera Horizon. Caldera would remain the superior numbers and tactics throughout the 4.0 faction build. Throughout 4.0 factions, there were many server stability issues preventing large-scale PvP. Oftentimes, when two large forces would clash, the lag would be so unbearable that it was impossible to fight, or the server would go down. With the introduction of the faction beachhead, losing teams at least had a place to recall and cool down before venturing forth again. Another new introduction was the ability to fight for forts and keeps to gain points for your faction. Points of interest including the mines, lumber mill, and quarry were also added. For the small group or solo player, the faction rule set allowed for the ability to join in a guild warfare without actually being part of said guild. However, this also meant that members of your own faction could not be attacked, so finding duels and small PvP started to become scarcer. To deal with this, players would often announce in general chat to the other factions, looking to duel or XVX at points of interest. During campaign world downtimes, many players could be found in Eternal Kingdoms, forming duel clubs to train and get assured PvP content. The newest playable class, Templar, was also added to the list of characters to play during the 4.0 testing builds, allowing players to play a class that could heal as well as tank. Crafting also made big strides in 4.0 Factions test. Players began discovering and writing down the combinations for bars and planks, as well as breaking down motherloads for the first time in any concerted effort. The first vessels were made in 4.0 before they were even usable, but seeing the possible stat gains started the player base on a journey to using increasingly stronger vessels. The Winterblades crafting guide was set up and is still maintained to this day, providing a wealth of information to both new and veteran crafters alike. This was the build where crafting stations were first implemented, forcing crafters to work in keeps or forts for a time, or in the Eternal Kingdoms. This led to some pretty interesting player encounters. One instance of crafting in keeps that led to a large hullabaloo was when members of Sugoi were getting inside of keeps and killing UDL crafters while they worked. Continuously setting them behind on crafting, UDL declared total war on Sugoi and booted their members from the Discord. This is one of the earliest instances of keep raiding and would spark the developers to begin investing in placing guards within more areas of a keep. Keep raiding would become more intense in later builds as players would figure out how to outwit the guards and harvest the sweet, sweet crafters within. Other notable bugs and exploits of this era would be the ability to use the iframes of your ultimate power to avoid instantly dying to the beachhead safe zone debuff. Right now you can see the same debuff affecting you if you try to go near an enemy faction's temple portal. This allowed players to enter into enemy safe zones and kill people who were AFK or not expecting it. One patch broke this even further by allowing players to maintain the invulnerable buff after spawning indefinitely by swapping trays. Players would then go into enemy beachheads and kill any player who had not swapped trays. This of course led to much unhappiness from those being killed, and these exploits can be seen as the precursor reasoning for making sure the temple safe zones had their own instance and could not be invaded by enemy players. The 4.0 Factions build was the first iteration of the faction-style warfare in Crowfall we all know today. In its rawest form, it provided less PvP content for those used to Big World, but it did provide a new space for making friends and enemies. The rumblings in 4.0 Factions would lead to a major political shifts within the next major milestone build of Crowfall 5.0. Build 5.0 and the Trials of the Gods. Build 5.0 and beyond encompasses a myriad of changes both in the Crowfall political scene and with how the game is played itself. Huge introductions were made, such as the Assassin class, and with it the race class split and the discipline system. The additions now allowed players to experiment with build combinations to min-max and counter enemy teams. Early 5.0 builds were very similar to 4.0 as far as the political climate of Crowfall. Status quo was maintained for the most part, as people tested out new races and class combinations, and there wasn't a big focus on winning campaigns or fighting in large groups. And this goes both for NA and EU guild politics. However, midway through 5.0, the dominant guild of Sugoi begins to be torn apart as a rift in ideology forms from within its player base. Many of the veteran players within the guild leave and join their rival Winterblades. Around this time as well, HOA splits away from the UDL and Death Alliance to make a name for themselves. Many of the Sugoi split will fall into HOA as well. Factions are swapped around, and now Winterblades are on balance, Sugoi and HOA are on order, and UDL's Death Alliance remains on chaos. For a long time, the forces remained relatively balanced, with each faction maintaining at least one large guild on the NA servers. Meanwhile, EU remains relatively unchanged, with KDS and Caldera maintaining numbers and strength superiority. It is also worthy to note that a new burgeoning Crowfall economy is beginning to be formed, as gold is now dropped from monsters, and player vendors are utilized to sell goods in the Eternal Kingdoms. Players begin to buy and sell goods for dust, embers, and gold at relatively stable prices, which are precursors to the prices we see today. Now we arrive in the beginning of the Trials of the Gods. The first Trials. The announcement of the Trial of the Gods set in motion a huge upheaval in the political landscape of Crowfall. Prior to the Trials of the Gods, there was no reward for winning. By adding a participation badge to the mix, the developers initiated a large upswing in player participation and anticipation for the Trials of the Gods. I will try to go over the trials that stood out most to me, as some I hardly had any playtime in. I also will mostly be talking about the North American sides of things, rather than the European campaigns, with the exception of the first trial, Malachi. The Trial of Malachi. The first trial announced was for the god Malachi, Lord of Shadows, Dreams, and Secrets. This trial is unique in that it is the only trial to award a gold badge to the entire winning faction. The campaign and each other faction would only get a silver-edged badge for participation. All of the following campaigns would see each faction receiving gold badges for their top participators, the percentage based on how that faction placed, and silver for the other members for participation. The Trial of Malachi started off with a large number of participants on both EU and NA. The players split between the Balance and Chaos factions, with barely anyone playing on Order. Of note would be Winterblades and HOA on Balance versus the various Death Alliance guilds and UXA on Chaos. On EU, the guilds went to either Order or Chaos factions, with no one really playing on Balance. Caldera and KDS teamed up on Order to fight every other EU guild, who banded together on Chaos in response. Fighting was fierce on the first day. The first siege on the North American campaign, sadly, was to be the only one. The forces of balance swept through and crushed the forces of chaos, sweeping the map and breaking the other faction's spirits completely. There was to be no more fighting or conflict within the North American campaign after the first night. The EU campaign was a very different story. There was intense and close fighting throughout the entire 2-week campaign between Order and Chaos. Some of the North American Chaos refugees joined EU Chaos to help them in their campaign, and North America Balance would intervene on weekends to influence the campaign as well. Outposts and forts were capped by both sides at nearly all hours of the day, and the keep sieges every afternoon and evening were large and brutal comparatively to any fights before in Crowfall. After a long and hard-fought campaign, the forces of Chaos would eventually come out on top and emerge victorious on the final day. This campaign highlighted many issues with the faction rule set, scoring mechanics, and siege combat. It would also set the tone for most of the next year in Crowfall. Balance NA would continue to be victorious as various guilds cycled in and out of playing the pre-alpha trials on Order and Chaos. A major point of contention among players spawning from this first trial was the usage of ballista offensively within a keep. The faction on offense was able to place them on all spots along the wall as soon as the siege began, and the defenders are now trapped, burning beneath continuous fire of offensive ballista. It was not a pretty thing to watch. Ballista still remain the entire focus of a siege to this day, as losing control of the ballista location spells doom for an offense or a defense of a keep siege. Another fun and terrifying bug utilized in these early trials was the use of overtuned physics effects to shoot opponents into the air or off ledges to kill them with percent health based fall damage. Confessors would often sync up their tornadoes and knockdown spells to throw players high into the sky and off ledges, killing them instantly when they hit the ground regardless of their health pool and armor. Force Mage Discipline users and druids would use a similar tactic to throw players far off walls or the map to instantly kill them. Much grief was caused using such tactics, and the physics effects were eventually toned down significantly in future builds. The Trial of Zelina. Immediately following Malachi, we received the Trial of Zelina. Continuing the momentum from their victory on EU in the previous campaign, the North American Chaos players switched back over to full commitment to the North American campaign. From this point forward, I personally played almost exclusively on the North American campaigns, so nearly all of what I will speak on will regard the North American campaigns. Most of the Death Alliance players did not return, but Chaos NA now comprised of a myriad of new, smaller guilds, Corvus Citadel, Revenant, Midnight Nation, and others, and diehard players of older guilds from LOD, LOTD, Spectre Legion, UDL, Sugoi Remnants, UXA, a whole hodgepodge, if I do say so myself. Balance remained mostly comprised of Winterblades and HOA, and some other tiny guilds. Order actually had a significant presence in this campaign, as 3 medium-sized guilds, Clam Stacking Casuals, Transcendence, and Infernal, were able to field decent numbers during a siege. The first actual 3-faction campaign was underway on North America. The fighting was intense all throughout this campaign, and more players were involved than ever before seen in Crowfall. The zones were capped at 100 players, and there was at least one capped zone every night during the sieges. This led to a lot of faction alt characters being logged in on all sides to do a /who of their faction in zone. Yes, this is the reason why /who was completely removed, to get a player count and see who was defending what and where. The use of faction alts for spying would remain a staple of siege nights even until present day. Because of this, however, forces would often wait to zone into a keep at the last minute, or log in well before a siege started to attempt to prevent the other side from responding and help ensure they would have their forces in the zone. Oftentimes, there were many people waiting in queue to get into zone. On some nights, there were multi-zone combats going on all at once. This trial also defined the siege meta until the health removal from armor in later patches. If you were wearing leather, you died. The forces of balance used this meta to the fullest extent. Every single one of their players was in either plate or mail armor of blue crafted quality or better. The Chaos Horde, as the Chaos faction would jokingly call itself, did not adhere to such a meta as strictly, and as such could be compared to barbarians wielding clubs and wearing nothing more than cloth and leather scraps. Many of the Chaos players didn't bother to make better gear than intermediate armor or white quality, and as consequences died extremely fast to ballista fire or enemy alpha warriors in droves. Numbers may have been on Chaos' side, but in the long run their failure to adhere to the tank meta of the time spelled doom for their attempted victory. There were many fun fights and epic siege battles every night in the Trial of Zelina, with circle standing in forts and outposts all throughout the day. Instances of cross-faction cooperation and backstabbery, were fairly common in the Trial of Zelina, making it one of the first actual 3-faction campaigns for better or for worse. The whole way through. In the end, due to superior logistics and organization, the balanced forces would emerge victorious, leaving everyone raring for more action in the next Trial of the Gods. The Trial of Valken. The main difference, to note, between Zelina and Valken would be that the Order faction guilds would split to make this next trial a 2-faction campaign, whereas previously Order did not possess the strength or numbers to have an actual shot at victory against both Balance and Chaos. The clam-stacking casuals would return to their Balance roots, joining Winterblades and HOA, and Transcendence and Infernal would move to join Chaos. With this being a 2-faction campaign, we saw a slight shift in dynamics as both sides looked even more closely at the capture bonus mechanic and season changes to capitalize on the score multipliers. Each keep siege took place, it was often determined by the sides taking these score multipliers into account and not really using them for their intended purpose as a catch-up mechanic. Much effort was put into this trial by both sides, but in the end, Balance would emerge victorious. Now, we move on to the trials of Cain and beyond. I was not present at all for the trial of Cain, so I cannot speak on its specifics, but I will note some guild and faction shifts as well as major gameplay element shifts that start bringing us to what we see today. After the first few trials, we begin to see a general decline in players logging into the campaigns. Numbers are still well above what they were pre-trials, but zone caps are not met on a regular basis during siege. The trial of Cain was a short trial in between Valken and Ilara, and the last trial before a complete item wipe. Many of the guilds on Chaos decided to mix around and split back between Order and Chaos, and Balance would secure another victory. There is a trend here that will continue throughout the trials. Every trial up until Cybele would see the same pattern. Guilds would shift around in Order or Chaos, some leaving, some joining, new faces, returning faces. Of relevance to the Chaos faction would be the dissolution of the guild Revenant and the formation of Hacks, which would remain on Chaos till this day. Balance would remain Winterblades, HOA, and clam-stacking casuals. With the removal of health from armor and the item wipe, we see some variances in the meta and a lessening of dependence solely on plate wearers in meta comps. With the addition of war tribes and war tribe loot, it became easier for new players to get in armor that was somewhat functional, allowing them to survive slightly longer in PvP situations. Many argued against such a thing at first, but in the end it has really helped the new player experience. Death mechanics would also change in later builds, making it more important to hold a fort or keep, and eventually respawn outposts. In order to maintain a presence in a zone with respawns, as you would need to fly to a statue present in one of these locations in order to res rather than fly back to your body as a crow. Another major change to how the campaigns worked was when the forts and keeps were put on siege timers to prevent capping at any hour. Instead of keep sieges being every night, they were reduced to Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday that we see today. The forts were put on rotating timers to prevent day and night capping, and ideally focus PvP in a few locations per hour. There are conflicting opinions as to whether this helped or hindered participation in campaigns, but with a low testing population comparatively to a faction size at release, it is hard to say. The Trial of Cybele. I separate the Trial of Cybele out from the rest, as it is one of the only trials where Chaos nearly achieved victory over balance, so it is noteworthy exception to the rest. On balance, many of HOA and Winterblade's forces were playing a different video game, and only some remnants remained playing with the clam-stacking casuals as they faced off against Chaos, comprising mostly of Hacks, Corvus Citadel, and UXA. For much of the campaign, Chaos was leading, but when the campaign reached the winter seasons, Balance was able to call back those members from another game to come and utilize the capture bonus multipliers of winter to secure another victory. The trials of Archon and Gaia would be business as usual, with Balance winning with no real change in opposition. The Trial of Yaga. The final trial of the gods to date would be Yaga. A noteworthy change in this trial would be that the clam-stacking casuals would move from Balance to Chaos. This influx of players would spur Chaos to an early lead in the first week, but then be overtaken by Balance in the fall-winter seasons, who would see victory. We also begin to see EU guilds playing on NA for Balance, starting with this trial, most notably the guild Vanguard, which is a splinter from Caldera that formed earlier on in the year. Being pretty out of EU politics at this point, I gathered that most of the EU guilds were taking a break and had stopped playing for the most part, so the only place Vanguard could go for any kind of PvP was the North American server. This, in general, caused a bunch of hullabaloo, but technically Chaos North America did this first in the Trial of Malachi. Beyond the trials into present day. Once the trials ended, for now, players still participated in various campaigns which did not come with a participation trophy. These were played with varying degrees of intensity, sometimes to the surprise of each side. Most of them were won by Balance, except the Cetane campaign, where Chaos was victorious due to the diligent efforts of the players still playing. Balance remained Winterblade's HOA and Vanguard, sometimes on the weekends, but there were some new spawnings on Order and Chaos with the formation of Conflict, and Eldritch on Order, and Byzantium on Chaos. Present day, our active population is small, with Winterblades and HOA still on Balance, may soon be called the Earth faction, Eldritch, Conflict, and Spectre Legion on Order or the Sun faction, and clam-stacking casuals, Corvus Citadel, Hacks, and the Knights of the Golden Vessel, and now sometimes Vanguard, as they've switched sides to Chaos for this last campaign, on Chaos, which is also called the Moon faction if you get confused. Oh, another fun thing that I almost forgot to mention are the Decapathons. Each faction will compete for the most player skull turn-ins to the sacrifice fire. The reward is a cosmetic skull belt item resembling the colors of the faction that won. So far, Chaos won the first Decapathon, Balance won the second, and the third Decapathon we'll have to see. Thoughts to the future. I have seen many guilds rise and fall, and a myriad of players come and go throughout this testing of Crowfall. As we begin to move towards Dregs and Alpha, I hope to see many of them return. Each time new memories were created, new stories were written, in the annals of history. The memories created and the individual stories of player experiences are vast and abundant. Far too many for one such as I to tell. Dregs will be a brand new era unto Crowfall itself, hopefully one filled with even more stories and experiences of victory, defeat, betrayal, conquest, and politics. I look forward to seeing them unfold. What will your story be?